Good morning and welcome to the forum. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral. It's so good to see all of you here today. We're very excited to have Daphne de Marneffe, who's here. She is an expert on counseling, psychology. She wrote her first book on motherhood, and her second book is called The Rough Patch, Marriage and the Art of Living Together. And I read every word of it, and it was took like extensive notes all through the middle. I was telling Daphne that I needed some like continuing education for pre-marriage counseling, and it was just about the perfect thing that we could have. Daphne works with individuals and couples in Corte Madera. She's a contributing writer for Parents Magazine, a parent educator at California Pacific Medical Center, and her work's been featured in the New York Times, OM Magazine, NPR, and Talks at Google. So please join me in welcoming Daphne de Marneffe. I have been thinking so much just about children, and I just think of like children are such an important part of your stories. I mean, because you're always considering what effect everything that happens in couples have on children. And it made me wonder just like about you as a child and what child experiences that you had that are helpful to you now. Mm-hmm. And then just how did you find your way into this calling?
My calling as a therapist or as someone who wrote this?
And as a writer.
Okay, yeah. So of course I could talk for 20 hours about these questions, but I guess I'll try to distill. So I guess I'll start with the clinical part and the writer part, and then go back to more the personal part. So in my work as a therapist, and if you're a therapist, you often find people come to you roughly at the same age range that you are. So I wrote this book on motherhood about parenting young children and the sort of identity conflicts that women have around the issue of caring for children. And then I was finding in my practice that people were coming to me kind of in their mid-40s as individuals or as couples and presenting some version of this problem. I've got the structure of my life, I've picked my partner, I've picked my job, I've decided whether I'm having children, I live in a house, but something about my emotional life isn't working. Something about my relational life isn't working. And so this kind of tension of structure, the structure's in place, but something about my life and my relationships makes me feel lost or empty or dead or confused. So I got really interested in this problem, this quandary, because obviously, to your point about children, that is a huge reason why people come together in a marriage, and it's a huge reason why they want to sustain a marriage. That really, sometimes when people are in that lost, empty, or confused place, the main thing that they're trying to hang on to is how can we work this out to be an intact and loving home for our children. So that's one of the things that people are really struggling with. And I practice in Marin, and you can imagine that's a place where people are struggling with that very issue, or many of them are. Yeah. And so I think that, in a sense, that's sort of a starting point for this whole project, which is how do you find a way to be authentic and emotionally alive and engaged and maintain this family, home, and structure that you have? And I think a lot of people confront some moment of friction in that. I think my own personal story, I grew up in the 60s and 70s in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is a little like Berkeley, California. It was sort of at the vanguard of the kind of divorce boom. My parents divorced when I was 8 in 1967. And I was always, from a very, very early age, way before that even, fascinated by marriage. It's no surprise that I became a psychologist. But I think I really, over time and over my adult life, thought a lot about their situation and empathized with the tension that they had between being loving parents and wanting to, stay married for us, but really being completely divergent individuals. And so one of the things in this book that I try to talk about is, from my point of view, a successful or a fulfilling adult life has to include some reconciliation of who you are as an individual with who you are in relationship and in couplehood, if that's the life path you choose. And that both are important and they're always in tension. And so the book is really trying to help people kind of through the process of developing on both fronts. And it doesn't always eventuate in people staying married, and there are better and worse ways to get divorced, obviously. So I'm also trying to help people keep this intention and, really think it through in their own way.
Yeah, at the very end of the book, you talk about being in conversation with yourself, knowing yourself, being in conversation with your spouse, and then being in conversation with the culture too. And I wonder, it's almost like the culture part became more of an explicit element by the end of the book. And we could see why, because some of the things that you're addressing, drug and alcohol, media, flirting, affairs, is really changed by the culture that we live in. Could you talk a little bit about that, just the cultural part of just that? I mean, because in a way, it's like the third element.
Right. So that relates to my motherhood book as well, in the sense that I think when women become mothers for the first time, they often feel this clamoring impact of the culture, what kind of mother to be, these messages, those messages, the myth of the perfect mother. So there's always this cultural piece of who am I now that I'm moving into this new role in the culture at large. And it sometimes can be incredibly oppressive to people, right? So, likewise, as couples, we're in a culture. I mean, if you've seen the ice storm, about the 70s wife swapping era, that was a whole cultural moment, but we're in a cultural moment now too. And I think part of the cultural moment, I have a chapter here called A Brief History of the Midlife Crisis, where I sort of talk about that as a kind of animating idea of the 70s.
Right.
And at that point, there was this notion in a lot of writing, especially about men's development, which had a sort of hero narrative that, and Gail Sheehy in her Passages book was kind of in this mode too, but it's kind of like, get out of oppressive relationships, unshackle yourself from, entangling attachments, and find yourself.
Yeah.
I think we've moved from that to understand that relationships are often at the core of our sense of meaning and purpose and emotional fulfillment. That it's, the people who are now in middle age are, parents were part of the biggest divorce boom in American history.
Exactly.
So they're all coming from a place of, I'd like to not do that to my kids. And yet sometimes they get married in sort of the mindset of, I'm not going to be one of those irresponsible adults I knew in my childhood. I'm going to suck it up and be mature. And then their emotional lives get put to the back burner.
Right.
So we see in our culture a huge emphasis on children and their emotional development and health, all of which, of course, is incredibly important and valuable, but sometimes it comes at the cost and is sort of seen as antithetical to the emotional and intimate relationship of the parents, and that gets lost. So I think in the culture now, we have a big emphasis on caring for children, which of course is wonderful. But as you alluded to, there are many new cultural mechanisms and forms that are very distracting.
Right.
There's our phones, of course. There's the internet. There's the fact that work has become this sort of 24/7 proposition. There's the fact that, everybody's juggling many roles. There's the fact of workplaces that have all sorts of complicated emotional relationships in them. So I think in some ways marriage is harder today than it has been in the past as a function of the progress, in a sense.
Right. It's less clear. The roles are just not as defined, too.
Yeah, and everybody is trying to put together an individual life that is full unto itself, but there's not as much division and sort of a lot of what people come into therapy for is division of labor. Who's doing what.
Right.
It's huge.
Yeah.
And it's not only who's doing what in terms of the practical tasks, it's who's holding it in mind.
Right, exactly. It's a sign of privilege that you don't even have to think about, how the children get to school or,
Yeah, or one partner feels like, I'm the person who's the CEO of this family and trying to keep everything in my head. You just are the person who's sort of saying, tell me what to do, and that becomes a huge issue. But I think it is all in the direction of progress in some sense. It's just very messy.
Yeah. It's interesting to think of us as being in a more sophisticated location than that idea of just like these total individuals, the 70s, who are on their own self-fulfillment paths, but not as defined in relation to anybody else.
Well, as a therapist, and anyone who's been in therapy knows this or even reflected on it, part of the difficulty of should I leave this marriage is, will I just basically get myself into the same situation because of who I am?
Yeah, completely.
And of course, a huge part of this book is trying to help you look at who you are.
Yeah.
But Yeah, I mean, I think people have become skeptical about the notion that if I just get rid of this, I'll be fine.
Yeah, it's funny, every year we choose a theme for the Cathedral. Our theme this year is truth. So we're talking about the truth about ourselves, the truth of other people, the truth about the earth, the planet, and then truth about God. And we're kind of wrapping up the real focus on a truth about ourselves. But what do you think is kind of the main truth that people just don't see? Like the thing that's the most common kind of form of just self-delusion or not paying attention?
Well, I think that the premise, or in a sense the thesis in this book, is taking off from this kind of structure passion thing I talked about, where people come to middle age or come to having been married for a while and are kind of like, I feel empty, I feel lost. The truth there is, I think, you can never get away from your emotional life. And in fact, a lot of times our model of adulthood is that you're just sort of supposed to suck it up and put one foot in front of the other. And what people find is incredibly disruptive and often painful is the wounds of the past, the baggage of the past, who you are as a person and who you are becoming. You can't ignore that forever. Basically, emotions are at the core of our sense of meaning. And they're at the core of our relationships. And if you don't work out your own emotional life, you're going to probably self-destruct in some way. You might turn to substances, you might become very shut down, you might get depressed, you might act out. But in other words, you can't back burner your genuine emotional nature in life forever. And this book is about kind of giving people permission and almost like a safe space to really think about their own emotional life and to think about, how do I express that truthfully and skillfully in relationship? Because I think sometimes people don't want to stir up the waters. They have an image of marriage as this sort of coasting forever. But that ends up being disconnection. And it actually always takes guts from the cradle to the grave to show up emotionally, to be honest about what you're feeling. And that's a daily practice in any intimate relationship.
Yeah, I mean, one of the favorite parts for me, I mean, there's so much in the book that I benefited from, but you talk about the difference between kind of the seesaw elements, which is kind of a zero-sum game kind of a approach to a relationship, and the golden ring. Maybe you could describe a little bit of that. I think if more of us had that kind of vocabulary, we'd do better at having those hard conversations.
So part of this idea of getting in touch with your emotional life and expressing yourself skillfully, and that to me is the core of a healthier, happy, intimate relationship, is that you know your emotions and can express them in a way that can be heard. And that is where almost all of us fall down. Sometimes because of how we grew up or the emotional climate in our families or maybe just our natural temperament. But in intimate relationships, often people come to therapy, they're like, I'm really a great friend and I'm great at work, but you drive me crazy, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a particular nature to what we might call an attachment relationship. It's a relationship we have with our parents when we're children. It's a relationship we have with our partner that is very deep, very physical, very emotional. Okay, so if you were to look at sort of the way in which couple dynamics derail, it's what I call the seesaw, right? One person's right, one person's wrong. It's a zero-sum game. If your feelings are real, mine must not be real. It's an argument about whose reality gets to dominate or who's right. And that is often hard to shift. And part of, I would say, couple therapy is all about trying to shift that basic feeling that your reality threatens mine. That if I really see how you feel and understand it and empathize with it, that cancels me out. And so this idea of the golden ring, I tried to create an image where you're standing next to your intimate partner and you're looking into this space in front of you together as friends, as partners, saying, wow, look at what we do to each other. Look how when you start doing X, I start doing Y. Isn't this sad for us? You know, in other words, you're able to say there's this relationship we have, we both bring our stuff and our baggage to it, we get into this ugly thing together, and we can sort of stand next to each other as friends and look at that without judgment, without blame, without criticism, and say, how are we going to figure this out?
Yeah, and what skills, how do you get to that point? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, practically speaking, because I
Yeah.
mean, in the heat of the moment, you're just trying to force your story onto the whole
Right,
scene.
right.
Like, how do you step back from that and do
Yeah, so I think the first thing to recognize is if you're a human being in an intimate relationship, you will do that.
Yeah.
In other words, I think sometimes we get so ashamed about our own limits, you know, that we sort of make it worse.
Yeah.
So a huge, 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 huge thing is that you can circle back and say, you know, I'm sorry I yelled, I'm sorry. You know, in other words, you have the ability later on, not in the heat of the moment, because a fight is defined
Yeah.
by the fact that you're not in this emotional state.
Exactly.
You're just in your thing,
Yeah.
right? So you have to accept that that's going to happen, but be a person who can, once you've calmed down, circle back and say, look, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
You
it's
know,
like being able to really listen to the person and to be able to show that you really heard them.
but maybe you couldn't in the moment
Yeah, you
because your biology was running the show, right?
Yeah.
That's part of being a human. So it's not and there is an analogy to little kids and parents. You know, people get stuck on this idea, I have to do everything right. No, you don't. You have to be good enough, and then when you don't do something right, you go and repair.
Yeah.
Repair is a big word in psychology, and I think it's a good one, because you have to go back around, circle back.
You know, that repair word, the first time I came across it was Daniel Gottman. He wrote a book on marriage.
John Gottman. Yeah,
That's right.
yeah,
That's right.
yeah.
He wrote a book on marriage. And that idea of a repair was
Yeah.
just opened up so many worlds
Yeah.
for me in terms of talking to couples. And
Yeah.
are there other ways that the whole field has changed since then? You know, what are the new things that people are talking about? Because that repair was a huge breakthrough for
So a big part of this book, there's a couple chapters where I delve very deeply into it, is this idea of emotional regulation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, you know, there were eras in couple therapy and couple thinking where, you know, there was the cathartic era where it's like, yeah, get your anger out. That'll be good. Okay, then there was the era of, you know, that's not going to help you.
Yeah,
you know,
just-
be mature, suppress. Right now we're in a whole new era, and this book is really trying to kind of map this out. Each person in a relationship has to work on their own ability to emotionally self-regulate, and that's a lifelong process. You know, and people need to find a way. I use 3 terms, and they're something that should be applied to yourself and to the other. Curiosity, compassion, and control. What I mean by that is self-control.
Yeah.
So if we look at what's the sort of basic tools or the basic elements of emotional self-regulation, it's being interested rather than is this good or this bad. It's like you're more in that negative capability of like, what is this? What am I doing and going through? So curiosity, that's something you want to apply to yourself and the other person. I'm interested in this. Compassion is, I'm a human being. I'm not always in full control. I will deal with this other person or myself with love and acceptance in some way. And then self-control is the kind of core emotional regulation piece, right? It's like, how do you find ways to soothe yourself? How do you find ways to internally in the moment say, okay, I'm not going to blow up here. I'm not going to shut down. I'm going to breathe. Right. I'm going to say I need to come back later. I'm going to, and there I want to say that self-awareness is the most important component, because if you can be aware that you're about to blow up and you can say, you know, I'm about to blow up. I think I need to go away and come back. That is incredibly powerful.
Well, even too, just differentiating, like, what is it that's about us, and what is it just about the rest of my life that's just like leaking into what's happening with us?
Well,
too?
and couplehood is sort of so vulnerable to scapegoating at any moment, right?
Yeah.
Because here you are and you're suffering and you're stressed and a million things are going on in your head, and here's this person sitting here you live with, and it's like they're just so obviously the person to blame for everything.
Exactly.
Right?
It's obviously their
It's
fault.
like, and what's complicated about that is what people actually do for each other in an intimate relationship is help each other unburden themselves, right? So if you come home from work, this is the person you say, I had the worst day, and this is why, and you need that from each other. That's key. That's why
There's
you're
no
with
one I can
each
talk to
other.
about at work about this.
Right. So there's that, but then when it shifts into you're my biggest problem, that's when it gets very problematic, and it's a really natural tendency. But again, if you can do that and circle back and say, you're not my biggest problem, sweetheart. I just am so stressed out right now. Then you're in that position where you're both like, okay, let's try to deal with that. Let's try to deal with that.
So what conversations should couples have before they get married? Like what should someone who's doing pre-marriage counseling know about, just in your opinion?
We just had this conversation before we started. I teach a class for people who are having their first baby, and there's sort of this balancing act when you're helping people at that moment of marriage or when they're having their first baby, where you're like so positive.
When you said that in the book, that was very interesting too. And I would love to hear more about that. Just like there are two moments in a married couple's life that are connected. Like you can tell something about how that we respond to our first baby, how we are going to be once they're all gone.
But I mean, as you were saying too, there's these moments where you want to help people amplify the positive, but recognize the negative. And of course, that's really hard when people are madly in love, or when they're sort of, decorating the nursery. They're sort of not necessarily in a state to really think about it. I want people to know, and this is why I called it the rough patch, like, this is normal. Life is bumps in the road, and how you deal with it. So don't feel something's terribly wrong with you that you're having a bad day. This is just kind of being in relationship, whether it's with a child or with a partner. But I think what I'm trying to get across in this book, in a way that people can hear, is a lot of being a good partner is working on yourself. And I think sometimes we forget that. In other words, we are trying to perfect or fulfill our own individual nature. At the same time, we're trying to be a loving, engaged person. And I think sometimes what I run across in doing couple therapy is one or the other person can't really take account of what they're doing. Right? And I would, I guess, in that early phase, say, always kind of try to be working on yourself here. How can you be a more intimate person? How can you be a more caring person? How can you be a more compassionate person? And if you're both doing that, that'll help you together.
Right. You talk so much about how work, I feel like you're totally right about work. We spend so much more time involved in work, and it almost squeezes everything out. And so church for one thing. It's just like hard to come to church when you've been working 90-hour weeks. But one of the things that's also changing is just social media and the internet. And I just wonder if you have tips on how to deal with things like, old, flames that come back into your spouse's life through Facebook. Or, there's a way in which the past has a different kind of hold on us now because of these new technologies. And I think that introduces challenges for couples these days. And I wonder if you can just, give us some pointers or tips or insights even about what it is that's going on.
Yeah, for one thing, we live a lot longer than we used to, right?
Yeah, that has an effect too.
It's been called the longevity dividend. People live 30 years longer now than they did, on average 100 years ago.
There's a lot more time for me to write boring theology texts.
Or be on Facebook. Right?
Or be on Facebook, yeah, good point.
Right, so the basic dilemma that I'm trying to address is people have an aspiration, an ideal to have a long, loving relationship with their partner. And it's much longer than it used to be. So we're talking about a lot of life phases. When the term midlife crisis was coined in 1965, midlife was 37. Now people probably say it's 57, or 47. So part of what we're talking about is a big challenge, right? Like, how do you stay in love with one person that you're having a life with and raising kids with and everything till you're, 85?
Right.
So what I talk about, I have a chapter called Love Sickness. I talk about how I think it's actually quite common that in the course of a long love relationship, people fall in love with other things and people. Maybe it's your stamp collection, or maybe it's your bike riding, but maybe it's someone at work, right? And so I try to talk about how to think about that in a way that is, not so extreme that you basically blow up your life and regret it.
Right.
But part of the whole book is about managing emotion, right? Feeling emotion, accepting emotion, skillfully managing emotion. And, people do get bored and depressed and start going on Facebook and thinking, what if I had married my high school sweetheart? And, what I talk a bit about in the book, and it's very challenging for people and sometimes better accomplished in therapy, but I do believe that when people start feeling that they're being carried away, that before they act on it, they should try to find a way to talk about it. Because I think that usually it's not the case that it turns out I married the wrong person, I should have married my high school sweetheart. Life's much more complicated than that. It's that there's certain ways I'm feeling empty, there's certain ways I'm feeling unsatisfied. It might be about us, but it might be about me. Right. What is it? How can I apply curiosity and compassion to this predicament I'm in, and accept that it's kind of part of the human condition, and have you be my friend in sorting it out? Now, again, that's challenging, but I would say it's an aspiration.
Yeah, definitely. And it definitely illustrates, what's at the heart of the book, which is having those conversations. I mean, one of the things you have in there, there's like this moment where you're talking about like body image, like so that if you feel like your spouse has gained a lot of weight, like how do you talk about that? Can you talk about that? Are there certain things that are off, shouldn't be talked about? And that was one of the things that I just felt like you're encouraging us to be brave.
Yeah. And brave can be, I'm deciding not to talk about something too, right? It's like I don't really, I think it's incredibly complicated. Right. And I'm trying to help people develop sort of a nuanced approach to their emotional life and kind of be a friend to themselves first. But for instance, that example, and I just got an email from a woman in Australia who said, oh, thanks, I love the book, but why didn't you talk about men and their beer bellies? Why did you talk about, a woman getting fat? I said, well, no, my case example was actually the man had gained weight.
Yeah, right, it was. Exactly, that's exactly right. And the woman was, it made it, I could see why it would be hard for him to even talk about how he felt. Because,
well, he felt extraordinarily ashamed.
Yeah, and ashamed, and then so you can make your partner feel more ashamed and kind of build up the wall for having that conversation. That's part of what she did. She could never really hear him because she was always belittling him she almost like didn't know any other way to address it.
Right. She sort of felt she was being just really candid. Right. But it ended up really being shaming
unkind.
him. Yeah. So I think in any long-term relationship, there are going to be things about the other person that you don't like. And maybe it's a body thing, or maybe it's an emotional thing, or maybe it's a habit or something. So, I think this is where, because these things are so personal and close to our core of identity, that it can feel incredibly challenging to talk about any of these. But I think this is where this golden ring idea fits in. If you're able to somehow slightly create a little space between your own personal reaction to this and the fact that your bigger goal together is to be a satisfying partner for the other person, then you can slightly shift your attention away from feeling attacked to feeling like, this hurts to hear, but I appreciate that you're telling me because it really is actually affecting how you feel about me. And I want to figure out a way to deal with that.
It's affecting how you feel about me.
And I don't want us to get alienated because of this. Now, that is not just one person's problem that they gained weight or whatever the thing is. It's a problem together that they need to figure out, because it may be this person can't lose the weight. It's like there are always going to be things about our partner that we wish were different and will not be different, right? And it's always this matter of like, what do you accept? And, we're a loving person anyway. And, what can be changed? And I think people are sometimes on the side of not pushing to change. They sort of, I've just got to accept it, and I'll just become more and more alienated. That's my plan. And I'm just saying, don't do that. Try to find a way to skillfully, compassionately talk to the other person. And it'll be hard, and it'll be messy. And it'll be painful. That's just part of the guts part of this, right? Like, God, the fascinating thing about human relationships is we never are attached once and for all. We rework every day the
Right,
loving
when
connection.
everything's changing so much. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, one of the, you talk about the children leaving the nest.
Yeah.
Our bodies deteriorating,
Yeah.
getting older. It changes in our work life. I mean, nothing ever stays the same. So even
Yeah.
if you had it figured out perfectly for how it was in 1998, it's, 1999 is going to be different.
Yeah, right. It's like when you have a 2-year-old and the child care is perfect and the jobs are perfect. You're like, oh, we're coasting
got
here.
it.
And then
Exactly.
suddenly they're 3.
Figured it out.
Right. So there's that need to keep, but what I'm saying is you actually, the hard work of marriage is staying emotionally vulnerable.
Yeah.
It's not the chores. It's like, how do I stay open? How do I keep staying open? How do I keep bringing the truth to this?
Yeah, yeah.
And people kind of want to coast. You want to watch TV. You want to check out. Like, it's natural human behavior. But I do think that these difficult issues, you have to keep having the hard conversations.
Yeah, talking is something that seems really important in the, your program.
Well, it is, and I feel like sometimes people are like, wait a minute, this is kind of biased toward the talkers. Like, we're not all big talkers, and why should it be that everything has to be talked about? And I talk in the last chapter, there are plenty of ways, obviously, to show
I like
love.
that too. Like going to a hardware store. Is the
Yeah,
example you
right.
use
I
of-
mean, people
so-
sometimes act out their love, but I do believe, at the end of the day, part of your project is to become a more skilled conversationalist about the relationship.
Yeah, I mean,
do
for us
believe
in
that.
our marriage, I mean, we go walking every Friday morning. So before we have our morning appointments, we go for a walk, and there's nothing planned, but things just kind of bubble up, and it means that there's like a discipline of talking that's built into our life always.
Yeah.
And I do think it really.
I love the idea of it being a walk, because
Yeah.
one thing I say to these couples who are having their first baby, I say, make a time of your week. It's not when you're going to bed, it's not date night, but it's a time when you're both alert to just check in and say, what's going on for you? Because it's so hard in a busy life to be the person bringing up the issues, because emotions are always messy, they're always time consuming. But I like this idea of this appointment being on a walk, because that's a little bit like when you're driving with a kid in the back seat and you can talk to them. It's like you're walking next to each other,
and
forward
if nothing
looking.
comes up and you just watch the pelicans, you watch the pelicans. But there is always something.
There's always something. Yeah, it never
and it's
goes
interesting because
away.
date night. You talked about date night, and here that was exactly our. I mean, there was so much pressure. We couldn't afford to go on date nights. It was just like, okay, now we're gonna have something really profound happen at 7:00 on Thursday night. We couldn't do that.
Yeah, or often people will try to just have fun, but then they start talking about the kids and they get in a fight, and then it just backfires. So I really try to say, if you're going to do the date night thing, it's supposed to be fun. Like, don't do the heavy stuff.
Right, that's good. That's really good. We take questions from the audience at the forum. So if you have questions for Daphne, please write them on the little card, and then Rebecca will collect the questions. We have teenagers, and the teenagers are starting to have their own romantic lives now too.
Yeah.
So the son brought home the girlfriend, and the prom's coming up, and all those things. I wonder. I mean, if you have any suggestions about what do you do in terms of talking to teenagers just about some of these basic skills and relationships?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. In fact, I was thinking I'd like to write another book about how to talk to your teenage and adult children about relationships, because it's this kind of complicated thing where if you've lived for a while, you have a lot of life experience that you could actually help impart. But of course, your kids are people who don't want to hear this from you, and they have to live their own life and figure it out for themselves. One thing I wish I'd done more of in the book actually is talk about the challenges of parenting teenage children, because I think it does bring up a huge amount for people in terms of, the first girlfriend or the first boyfriend, and they're so romantic, and what's my life, and the paths untaken, and your own youth, and so it can be a challenging time in that respect for parents. But I also feel like so many people I see in adulthood as patients will yearningly talk about wishing their own parents had talked to them more genuinely and more frankly about sex and about relationships. And so I think there is a real yearning often from kids, even if they don't express it directly, to not for you to talk about when I was your age and go off into your own story that doesn't relate to them, but more like really be interested. I mean, they'll tell you if they want to talk, but I mean, you do have life experience and they do respect you probably.
Well, I mean, the main way it comes up in your book that I remember, when you talk about the husband, well, the child goes off to college, and the child and the father have a very close relationship, texting all the time, and the mother really feels like it's important to just like really launch the child and not have this continuation of childhood.
Yeah.
And the father says, well, you know, if this child wants to move back into the house, then we're going to have a problem.
Yeah. Right. I mean, as we said, every stage has its challenges. I mean, people may really differ on that, right?
Yeah.
One person's like, oh, it'll be really great if they come back. And I have to say, as someone with adult children, you know, the adolescents can be stormy, but once they're their own person, you know, there is this lovely thing where you actually enjoy each other as kind of adults at
Right,
different stages of adulthood, but a lot of that static goes away. But I think people do have very different views of the empty nest. And, you know, some research was done a couple decades ago that said women are actually much more relieved by the empty nest than men tend to be, partly because often, traditionally, they were sort of the more kind of hands-on, at-home parent. But people do have very different feelings. And, you know, again, it's one of these things of how are you going to mesh that?
Yeah, exactly. And what possibilities does it open up for you? And how lucky and fortunate are you in having new possibilities that are available? You know, because there is a chance for new exploration that happens then too.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I did this kind of workshop with people who are sort of at this phase, and one of the guys in it said, you know, I just feel like such a beginner and kind of so lost. Like here I'm 55 or whatever, and it's like, I don't know what my life's about anymore because the kids have just gone. But I do encourage people to see that as an opportunity.
Right,
you know?
exactly. You know, legalization, I was thinking about that just on the substance abuse. I just wondered how legalization of cannabis just kind of affects, you know, what do you see happening? I mean, just...
Yeah, I mean, I can't talk generally because it's so anecdotal. I mean, I just see the people who come in to see me. But I mean, just yesterday I was talking to someone who, you know, has a cannabis habit. He'd probably have it whether it was legal or not.
Right.
You know, it's clearly, I mean, my whole chapter about substances is basically like, you know, substances often make you feel like you're more connected to people, but actually you're less connected.
That's great.
And so
I totally wanted you to summarize that for me because I did get lost in the weeds.
Yeah.
So basically when you say everybody's drinking at happy hour, thanks. You guys are even better than I am. It's like all subconscious, you know. But yeah, you had that moment where you talk about like happy hour and everybody feels this kind of conviviality, but are you really connecting? Is that a real...
Yeah, and I mean, let's face it. I mean, we're so busy. We're juggling all these roles. Life's incredibly stressful. Of course, people want to come home and chill out, right? I mean, so it's always this balancing thing of what's really helping you relax and shift gears and what's making you kind of go off into your own world and disconnecting you.
Right.
And that is often a fine line. And so, you know, I see a lot of people for whom, you know, one person is taking that further than the other, but generally my view is that at a certain point where something like drinking or smoking shifts into excess, you know, it is basically a disconnecting thing. And the irony or the illusion of the person ingesting is somehow they're one with the universe now.
Right.
And in fact, they're usually checked out and not able to be talked to. I mean, you know, the other spouse is like, I really want to actually talk to you, but you're not there. You know, and they're like, oh yes, of course I'm there. You know, and then we get into kind of.
That was very helpful because like I said, I just there were several times I kept thinking, oh, I really want to, you know, almost get your summary of these things. But we have so many good quick questions.
Okay.
So insight for post-parenting, post-empty nester, but still working couples, i.e., when restructuring thinking as retirement years begin. So post-parenting, post-employment nesters.
Yeah, I mean,
post-empty nesters.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have a certain kind of fear, sort of a jumping off the cliff fear, like, okay, here we're alone in this empty, echoing house, and, you know, we haven't even really dealt with when we're going to stop working, and we might have really different ideas about this, and it can feel kind of exhausting and challenging.
And having a child there was what actually brought you home. Otherwise, you just keep working all the time.
Yeah, right. And so, again, you know, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but, like, this does take talking and like figuring, and where are we at now? And, you know, one thing I notice, people sometimes think a happy marriage is when there's no conflict, and I'm almost on the opposite view. Like, basically, I mean, my husband and I also take a weekly walk with the dog, and every time we're probably talking about one of our kids and with the latest challenges, and, you know, I feel like they're not easy conversations. They're stressful, there's problem solving involved, but my view of couplehood is you have problems in front of you that need solving, and being able to tolerate the difficulty and discomfort of that is how you solve these problems. So I think the empty nest is one of these moments. It has all these possibilities, but it has all these fears, but it has all these hopes, but it has all these maybe differences of opinion that were somehow submerged when you were on your system with the kids. So I guess I would say there's no like general answer other than we're actually trying to unearth what we each think and mesh our different beliefs and styles and feelings. And that, is a project, unto itself.
Yeah, definitely. Carole King says, something inside has died, and I just can't hide, and I just can't fake it. Mm-hmm. So it's from a popular song.
Yeah.
So do you have a comment for that?
Yeah, so my basic view of how people get there in a long-term relationship is that either there's been some kind of injury, some kind of moment in the relationship that was truly wounding, and someone kind of just shut down.
Oh, yeah.
Or there's a constant, subtle decision-making on one or both parties' parts to not re-engage and deal with what's in front of you and deal with the heat and the difficulty and the fear and whatever of that, but to sort of rely less, need less, connect less. And I do believe people reach a point of no return. Now, I'm not talking about, the fireworks of love that fades in 3 months. I'm talking about a long-term relationship where there's been a commitment and an emotional dependency of some kind. And I do believe, and I see this in my office, people get to a point where I've been through this so many times, I'm basically gone. I'm lost. I'm shut down. I'm not interested in trying again. And part of my job or my effort is to help people before they get there, because I do think it happens, and I do think it's a rational decision at times to cut your losses and say, I will never get this back. And part of that, and what I really try to write about in this book, which a lot of people don't talk about in kind of my world of couple therapy, is that loss of desire to connect. How incredibly painful that is, how conflicted and terrible people feel about feeling it.
That was one of the times I felt most relieved, when the couple realized the wife she's never going to have a breakthrough. She would never, be okay with her husband.
Yeah.
And and I was just relieved that they just recognized that.
Right. So seeing that, what I talk about there is the, sometimes people have to leave when they feel like their sense of truth and integrity is in direct contradiction to loving this person. In other words, your view of me or what I'm supposed to do in this relationship or what you're supposed to do is so antithetical to my sense of the truth of this situation that I can't reconcile it. I can't keep turning toward you if I feel your basic worldview is so at odds with mine.
Right, if you think that something I've done has made it impossible for the children to ever thrive, and you can never give that up, for instance.
Right, so...
that was a really powerful example. I think that's what helped me a lot, is the examples.
Yeah.
I love the abstract, and I needed that too to help put it in order, but I really like the examples.
Okay.
Here's a question. Did you see the film I Do Until I Don't?
No.
Okay.
But I should, clearly.
Okay. How do you rebuild trust when trust is lost? Example, after cheating and spouse is not forgiving. How do you rebuild trust?
Spouse is not forgiving, which would be...
How do you rebuild trust when trust is lost?
So trust is obviously at the foundation, right? Trust is necessary. In my own experience working with people, and I actually have to say this is one of the most touching parts of the work that I do, because people work so hard to find that when they want to stay together, and it's a bumpy road. And even when the hurt partner in an affair situation, is willing, they're often months and even years of sort of these post-traumatic stress moments, and it's the person, the unfaithful partner will sort of feel like, aren't you over this yet? But then feel guilty about feeling that, and so forth. So I do feel that if both people want to try to rebuild the trust, there is a possibility, and therapy I think is helpful in this, to really, as I talk about throughout the book, but particularly in this situation, to really look at everything. Affairs often happen for complicated reasons. There may be aspects of the relationship that are problematic or not working. The person who's been unfaithful has to fully accept, their role, the other person. Where this gets difficult, I think, is either where people see it as, I actually realize this is the end of the line and I don't really want to rebuild trust, or if someone maintains themselves in the position of saying, you've basically done this horrible thing to me, and I will never forget it or forgive it. I mean, at a certain point, that phase has to pass. But it's really a one-by-one thing.
Yeah, and it seems like it's hard to judge how long each of these phases should last and what's reasonable.
Yeah, and I think that's why a third party can be really helpful in terms of just like sitting with both people and honoring what they're going through, because again, this is one of these super tricky things for each person feeling, blame and shame and so forth.
When you were talking about just like, say the spouse being overweight question, is, like there was a bunch of times like just having someone coach you on that conversation, it would be great if there was somebody that you could talk to, you could practice a little bit.
And I'll just say something about that. When I give that golden ring example of you're both standing looking at this, it helps to have a third person, because this seesaw or hot potato where you're constantly like, you're at fault, no, you're at fault, no, you're wrong, no, you're wrong. That's this kind of back and forth dynamic, and it's actually almost spatially helped by having a third person there saying, I see you, and I see you, and you're both good people, and you're both trying hard. And sometimes people can't access that in themselves. About the other person, about themselves. They're too ashamed, they're too angry. So just even being, maybe it doesn't have to be a therapist. Maybe it can be a friend, or a priest.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's. I think about pre-marriage counseling. That's a lot of what it is. It's having conversations that you would never have otherwise, that just don't arise. That someone's there to kind of keep the ring in order. Okay. There's a maxim or sayings: a burden shared is a burden lightened. Having been married this July and 25 years, having made the move to Northern California 3 years ago, downsizing from a large farm, a limitation of my wife is recognizing long-term issues of danger. When I started having health and cognitive issues, this limitation became glaring. So his challenge, I think, is his wife not recognizing his changing health situation.
Right, so that reminds me of, something that can come up at other phases too, maybe with children or any, it's so, people are attached, people are bonded, they're committed. They care about each other, they love each other. They each have their own vulnerabilities and capacity issues, right, for stress and so forth. So it's very common in a couple for one person to feel that the other is, their bandwidth or their tolerance of stress is too low for them. In other words, if there's something that shakes things up, then they really kind of get overwhelmed or flooded. And that can often lead to blame and criticism because they're just trying to keep themselves together. And so in a situation where, say, you're sick, it's totally natural and human to feel taxed by the burden of someone else's dependency, right? But part of what we're always trying to develop in ourselves is more bandwidth, more give, more resilience, more ability to contain that. That's what we try to give each other. We're not always going to do great, but I think in a situation like that, the hope is that the person can say, it's painful to me when you feel so mad at me for having these difficulties, these weaknesses or these burdens. And is there some way we could work together to make this easier on both of us? Because it's so painful for me to feel so alienated in that situation. But life keeps throwing these things, right? And you learn about your partner and how resilient they are by going through them. And that can be a real moment of reckoning too, right? Because it's like, wow, I love my wife, but she just isn't that able to be supportive about this. And that's really painful and lonely. And to the extent that you can sort of empathize with each other about that, that'll hopefully help you a little bit.
Yeah. Here's a tough question. Is it wise to stay open emotionally or stay at all if your partner is manipulative and abusive?
A simple answer is no.
Okay, good. I figured that was what you were going to say.
But I'll just say one thing. Before you completely throw in the towel, you might just spend a little time thinking about, okay, is that the whole picture? Is that the whole story? Is there a way I'm playing into this that I'm not totally owning? Understand your part in this, even if it's just like, how will I manage to never be with such a person again?
Right, completely. Yeah, you have to understand it. What do you do when money generates the conflict? That's the question the person asked. I like the way that you call it the knife in the drawer.
I have a chapter called Money, the Knife in the Drawer, because it's this, money is this very primitive thing. It's about survival, it's about identity, And it sort of pulls on, I think, very primitive emotion in people. And so the golden ring is really hard to find often with money. And so it's very, very common, money issues. And I guess I'd read my chapter as my answer to that.
Yeah.
I mean, I've given a lot of thought to why money becomes a problem and how to help people with it.
Yeah, and again, that's another of the chapters where it's hard to summarize it all in one.
I mean, I could try to say a little bit if you want, or if you want
I think it would be worth hearing. I mean, money just has so much power in our lives.
So I think this is, I mean, to try to be really brief about it, because it's such a primitive issue, it is one of the places where it's hardest to find a position of collaboration. And it's very easy to fall into a who's good and who's bad. Oh, you're a spendthrift. Oh, you're a miser. And, you know, there's sort of very charged conversations get going about what's wrong with the other person. And money stuff is so deeply formed in one's childhood, along with everything else. So there are very deep hopes and fears attached to it that people are often not conscious of. And so this really demands people getting in that place together where they're like, we're a unit. We need to make sure to take care of us. How are we best going to do that around money? Yeah. And that's just super challenging for people.
Yeah. How often do you see a situation where one person feels a need for couples therapy and the other person in a relationship feels everything is quote unquote fine? Mm-hmm. How do you manage that? And how do you think one person in a relationship can encourage couples therapy without making it a drama or a thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this book is kind of trying to be a sort of couple therapy for the masses in the sense of like saying, like, we all have emotional lives. All of our emotional lives are complicated. That's not your special problem. That's just being a human. I think often this dynamic of we're fine, you know, this falls into a certain pattern where one person is the one who feels they need to resolve emotional issues to feel safe and connected, and the other feels their best strategy is to sort of avoid them, and that's how they feel safe and connected. There's different names for this, pursuer, withdrawer, we have different terminologies. But basically, you know, my belief is that if one person feels help is needed, the other person should try to listen to that. And I think usually they don't want to go into that because they're scared. You know, they're scared of unpacking stuff. Their basic emotional strategy is to, you know, minimize and suppress and hope things go away. You know, and so that's not to say that sometimes the problem in a marriage isn't that one person is overreacting all the time and the other one's like, hey, calm down. You know, so that might be the person who's saying, you know, we're okay. No, we're in an emergency, right? And so part of the therapy or part of working that out might be like, how do we help you not see everything as an emergency? That we're still good, even if in that moment you're not getting exactly what you need or so forth. So it can work either way, right? And my whole argument about emotional regulation is we're trying to help people not shut down or get overwhelmed, right? We're trying to find that sweet spot.
Yeah, exactly. This wasn't one of the questions written on the paper, but one of the questions I had for you as I was reading is just, you know, how are gay couples different than straight couples? You know, what can they learn from each other? Those kinds of things. You don't really address it very much in the book.
Yeah, so I work in Marin County, and I have some lesbian couples who come to me. I have not treated one same-sex male couple in Marin County. I treated one couple where one of the people was transgender, but so I don't feel I have like the necessary experience to speak to that. I feel what I try to do in the book is give information that I think is relevant to any intimate relationship. Obviously, there are going to be differences in different cultures and different, you know, subsections of, you know, this culture. But I'm trying to talk about things that I believe to be fairly universal psychologically and that apply to intimate relationships in general.
Yeah, that's great. It's interesting too because you're probably involved in like a continuing education world too, in terms of you'll know things that we don't know from that.
Yeah.
Here's a good question. Multiple generations living under one roof seems to be a trend. Is this a return to normal? Is it good or is it bad, or what special challenges does it offer?
Yeah, again, I'm not a sociologist. I have given a tiny bit of thought to this because, you know, I'm at this stage with young adult children and we all talk among our friends like, oh, gee, you know, what does it mean mean for them to, you know, move home or this or that? Like, is this they're not, we didn't encourage independence, and then we say to ourselves, wait a minute, this situation is a real blip in the history of humanity.
Right.
This notion that everybody moves away and gets their house and isn't living together, like that's not the norm for most of human history. So as you might expect, I think, generally, I think it's a mixed thing. I mean, I think there are reasons why people want to move away from their family, and there are also reasons why they want to be together. And I do think as I age myself and start fantasizing, oh, maybe I can have a little in-law apartment in one of my kids' houses,
Yeah, exactly.
you know, and then thinking, I'd never want my own parents to be doing that. I'm thinking, okay, well, you know, I was just out with some friends yesterday, we're saying, like, maybe that all comes down to what kind of relationship you actually have with each other. You know, it's not parents should do this, children should do that. It's more like, how do you actually get along?
Right, exactly.
Maybe that's the criterion.
Yeah, that's a great thought. And then how would that look in future times, too?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess in a utopian way, wouldn't it be lovely if the 90-year-olds could be sitting in the family living room watching TV,
Yeah,
you know,
completely.
like, you know, or playing chess with a grandchild, and everyone felt cared for. And I mean, there's a huge problem with isolation with old people.
Exactly.
And even if they live near their kids, they're often in an apartment by themselves living near their kids. And so, I mean, the economics may dictate new arrangements, and maybe there will be a silver lining to that.
Here's another question just about what have been the typical duration of marriages for those married in the 60s, the 90s, and 2000? And what are the reasons for the differences?
Yeah, you know, I don't actually know how to answer that. I do know that, you know, there was this divorce boom from the late 60s to about 1980.
Yeah.
And now what it seems the research is showing is that people with more education and more money are staying married at higher rates than they did in that era. And the people with less money and less education are either marrying less or divorcing more. So we have this sort of two Americas situation that we have in so many other spheres of life. And people think that gender equality has actually improved marriage in the sense that it used to be, first of all, that women with education were less likely to be married. Now they're more likely to be married. But also it seems that the fact that roles have been more equalized is actually a net positive for marriage, even though what I see in my office is a lot of role juggling and who's doing what and friction around that issue. It does seem that equality has probably had some impact on making marriages more sustainable.
Yeah.
But I'm, again, not a sociologist.
Yeah, exactly. There's also, there's a greater stability when both partners are capable of having jobs too. I mean, you know what I mean? You're not dependent on one person.
Yeah, and I think people can advocate more for their own well-being in a sense, because there isn't this sense, well, I got to put up and shut up and because I can't support myself.
Right. Because I have no other options.
Yeah.
No, that's really true. How do you deal with a partner who's checked out emotionally with alcohol?
Yeah, this is a really tough one. So I mean, there's a huge raft of literature on this issue, and I'm not a substance abuse expert per se, but you know, I think often a person who's checked out on alcohol and persists in that habit is in some kind of denial about the habit and its negative impact. And I think you have to try to speak the truth to that person about how it's impacting you, what you think it's doing to the relationship, and what you're afraid is going to happen. If, you know, I mean, people are often very reluctant to apply leverage. And, you know, Al-Anon and those sorts of things are really about, you know, this is not, you know, you can't fix this person. Mm-hmm. Don't even try. You know, I mean, you got to take care of yourself. But in a marriage, I do think sometimes people are afraid because often people grew up in sort of alcoholic family systems themselves.
Yeah, what you described too is, I mean, basically what's happening in that situation is that the person is choosing their addiction over the person they're with.
Yeah, and I'll just say, when that person, if they ever decide to get sober, the whole family dynamic changes. Yeah. And that next phase is called transition, and it can be hell. Yeah. Because the whole family dynamic has been sort of created in this context of one person checking out. So even if the goal is to not have them be checking out anymore, things get rocky before they find a way to stabilize, usually, because that's how it's developed. So it's complicated, but I believe people should persistently confront
Yeah, people need to talk with one another.
Yeah.
2 years into marrying my beloved at 50, I remain blissful at the union, and having been single for decades, I note how little the mainstream culture supports friendship within a couple. Any advice? Here, you can read it.
Well, okay, I mean, I'll just have to kind of free associate or riff on this because I'm not sure what the hope was here. But, I mean, this golden ring idea, it's really being friends, right? It's being on each other's side.
The question was about friendships outside of the couple. Like
Okay, that's good.
Seeing my old friends.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, that's really interesting.
We talk about that in pre-marriage counseling a lot. Like,
So-
what is your relationship to other people outside the couple?
That's so interesting. See, I wouldn't have known that the culture is doesn't support friendship outside. I would think in a couple, there might be a feeling on one person's part.
I feel like it's culture. I have this rich friendship.
Yeah.
There are a lot of demands of being in a couple, but just there aren't prompts. There's so much reinforcement for being in a couple from outside and within my couple, with my partner, but I feel like the society doesn't support friendship.
Okay, so that's really interesting. I mean, I feel like I know the couples I see, often between the kids and the job and the couple, they don't see their friends. So there's that. And so I guess that could be like, why is that category moving kind of to the bottom of the list? Since I see people in these sort of intimate couple sort of therapy situations, the way that exerts itself is, one or the other feeling the other's spending too much time with their friends or not allowed to, that kind of thing. But I guess this whole question, I guess it would come down partly to how the larger community, the sort of bowling alone problem, right? The larger community of like connection is so atrophied, right? You must feel that about
definitely.
churches, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of like that part of life, which actually could probably make most of us less depressed, less anxious, because like we all need to be around people.
Right.
That part is very atrophied, I think, in our culture, right? So it might be like you're saying, like this cultural kind of message or atmosphere we're all sort of steeped in that we don't really even...
Right, it's a kind of a failure of community, really,
Yeah, and it kind of feels like, we don't have time for that.
Yeah,
right?
It's funny because one of the things we talked about when we first started was, there's a way in which we're a little bit more savvy about our own emotional life, maybe in the year 2018 than we were in 1978. But the cost that's come at is we don't have those community institutions.
But
like
I
that.
wonder, people must be writing about that.
If you go to the Elks or to like a play or
Yeah.
or
rock concerts.
Now at rock concerts even. But you look out at the people in the play. They're all gray hairs. Everybody's retired. That element
interesting.
too. So it's just like people are working so much it takes over their lives.
Well, and I can't speak because of my age. It's sort of how does social media create that for those young people who we don't understand. Maybe they feel they're in community.
Right. It's been such a pleasure having you today. I wonder if you could just kind of maybe help us sum everything up. So when we go home today, what is the most important thing for us to remember about our encounter with you?
I guess, one thing that's made me happy when people read this book or talk, they say, I was nicer to my partner today.
Oh, that's
after
good.
that. So I do feel like what I'm hoping that this sort of normalizing aspect of this, this is just kind of what it means to be in a long-term relationship, could be helpful to people. I guess I would say, we have this work ethic that we apply to everything, including our relationships. And we just need to work harder and develop better habits and put an app on our phones to remember the 7 things we're supposed to do. And I really do think the work is to be open.
Yeah.
And that is work.
Yeah.
Because it takes guts. And
an encouragement to say what really bothers you and to not just, and to allow, on the side, outside of that ring together, to allow a conversation about what it is.
And to not tell your partner if they do tell you what bothers, stop complaining.
Right, completely.
Because I think that it is an effort to be close.
Yeah.
When people share what they're really feeling.
It's almost like ability to take criticism too. It's just like about taking a step to really hear what the person's saying. And
so curiosity, compassion, self-control.
I love it. Curiosity, compassion, and self-control.
Yeah.
Well, it's been such a pleasure having you today,
Thank you.
Daphne. We have the 11 o'clock service happening upstairs right after. Next week, we're going to have the San Francisco Poet Laureate and member of the Cherokee Nation, Kim Shuck. She's going to be talking about the conflict between public art, historic preservation, and racist representations. It should be a really good conversation. If you're able to give us a gift, that would be really helpful to help share the cost of the program. That would be great. And thank you so much to you, Daphne. We're so blessed by what you've given us.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.